usually you have to pay people to do that, so I'm just going to assume you weren't paid, but maybe you were given some extra credit to show up. But we're going to try to make a really tough topic that I think is increasingly relevant, and that we are hearing about more and more in the news, and we're going to hear more about it, not less. And so I think as Christians, we really need to kind of think through this tough issue. And really get to a place of what should we do about income inequality, if anything, and if we're supposed to do something, how exactly do we do that? I only have a limited amount of time, so we're not going to be able to solve all the world's problems as they regard income inequality tonight, but we're going to try to take a stab at thinking both biblically and economically about this very kind of complex issue. As Dr. Pearson said, I work for the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. We are a biblical advocacy think tank that we're located in McLean, Virginia, so we're right outside of DC. And our mission is to help Christians think through a biblical theology of faith, work, and economics. What does that mean? Those three words don't necessarily seem like they go together. Faith, your work, and then economics. Economics to most of us seems like a very macro, distant concept. You probably think of words like GDP per capita and budget deficits, and then your eyes glaze over and you close the book you're reading or turn the channel, right, off of CNN. But economics starts with the individual. And so at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, our presumption, as I like to say, is that a lot of Christians, and we speak to Christians, so we're not trying to convert people, we're actually trying to speak into the lives of people who claim that they're evangelical Christians. And what that means to us is you believe that Scripture is inerrant, and it applies to all of life, so that we can go to the Scriptures for all of these questions that we have, whether it's who should I marry, what church should I go to, or how do I solve the problem of income inequality. Now, the Bible is not an economics textbook, so you can't go and nicely look up a definition of the law of demand or comparative advantage, but there are principles in the Bible, and we believe that economic principles come from biblical thinking and good stewardship. So that's what we're about. And we believe that most Christians kind of think of their lives in a silo. That what you do on Sunday and your prayer life and your spiritual life, that's one thing, and God really cares about that. And then you have this thing that you do called work, which is actually, incidentally, where we spend most of our productive hours, right? So if you work a job from 9 to 5, you're going to school, most of your productive waking hours throughout the week are dedicated to your work, to your profession. That could be something for which you earn a financial monetary return, but you could also do philanthropic work and volunteer work. So all these things are work, and we believe at the Institute that work is a pre-fall ordinance. So we were called to work in Genesis before the fall of man. So work shouldn't be a drag. It shouldn't be something that is drudgery or something that you hate, even though I venture to guess that we've all had a job we didn't like before. I certainly have had my fair share. But that when we reconcile that God has called us to work, and through work, we not only get personal fulfillment, but our work has eternal kingdom-building significance, and as well, if we do our jobs with integrity, we can make the world a better place. That is liberating, and it's exciting. It's also humbling at the same time. So that's what we're about. I want to start, and I'm hoping we don't have internet issues, with just a little kind of introductory video to who we are, and then we're going to jump right into the topic of income inequality. We don't have sound. Oh, it's me. I am so technologically not savvy, by the way, sorry.
With one part being sacred and another...
Sorry, I'll start over.
Our lives are not divided into two halves, with one part being sacred and another part secular. Worship is not reserved only for Sunday morning, but for Monday morning as well. Every time we get out of bed and ready ourselves for the day, Every time we labor at a task, no matter how insignificant it may seem, every moment is a gift. Every moment belongs to the one who gave us that moment. There is a way that leads a man to flourish. It is freedom. The freedom to discover his true potential, to keep the fruits of his labor, to find fulfillment in his work. These freedoms are the right of every person, because they come woven into the God-given dignity of every person. Where they exist, societies and people flourish. Where they are absent, there is only poverty. These freedoms must be championed, for this is God's design for us, for the good of all He has created.
Okay, so those three words, freedom, fulfillment, and flourishing, that's really what we are about as an organization. So that is why we would take on the topic of income inequality. And so kind of the premise of how kind of we even started thinking about why is this an important paper to write, what does it have to do with you guys, with us, when we wake up in the morning, you know, how do we fit into these big policy issues, and what, or if anything, can we do to make the world a better place? So we're starting from, you know, going right to Scripture and saying, look, work is something that can bring us delight, and it can make the world a better place. But we have to live in a society that promotes that allows people the ability to say, hey, you know what, I want to operate a food truck as a career, or I want to open my own business, or etc. It could be anything. Because the thing is, you each were created to do something that only you can do. And that's the beauty, I think, of understanding the Christian perspective of our anthropology, which is that we were created uniquely in the image of God. Because He's unique, we bear that uniqueness as well. And so even though we're all different, and we have different, you know, talents, we all bear similarities as well. But we're distinct. And that uniqueness means that God created you to do something that no one else can do. I think that's very inspiring and liberating. And so we need to live in a world or a society that lifts that up, that elevates that. So the poorest among us have opportunities just like the rich do. So how do we get that kind of world? What does it look like? And as Christians, what is our role in bringing that about? So this is kind of where we came from when we decided we're going to tackle this question of income inequality. This is just kind of, this is my paper, and I just came from DC where we got 9 inches of snow. In DC, people freak out when there's 1 inch of snow, so 9 inches, you know, the whole kind of city shuts down. So I actually didn't bring copies, but if you go onto our website and you're interested in reading the whole paper, it's there. And I'm also going to ship copies if you guys are interested, so you can have them soon. So the question is, how do we reconcile income inequality in the United States with poverty? The real question at hand when we think about these types of issues is, are the rich getting richer at the expense of the poor? Is this what's happening? And if it is, it's a real problem. So we have to do something about it. So then the question is, well, what do you do? Because it's not easy to kind of overcome. So again, I kind of talked about uniqueness, but I think, and you know, I'm an economist. I'm a Christian first, but I'm an economist by trade second. And so for us as Christians, we first have to go to the Scripture for guidance on these issues. We have to look at the biblical principles to help us form our worldview, and then to help inform us in terms of where we should come down on these policy debates, but I think it's really important to use good, sound economic thinking. Because good, sound economic thinking is ultimately about being a good steward. And we know as Christians we are called to do that. So if we can't just, we don't have the luxury of throwing mud against the wall in terms of policies and just seeing what sticks. Because there's going to be a high cost associated with that. There's going to be a lot of waste. And we can't do that. Number one, Economics 101 principle, we live in a world of scarcity. So everything that you do, by definition, has a distinct cost associated with it. You are here tonight listening to me. You might have something better that you could be doing, right? Though that is your opportunity cost for being here. Policies have opportunity costs too. So if our concern is to help care for the poor and long-term elevate the poor out of poverty, meaning we're not just focused on how to help them get their next meal. That's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for poverty alleviation. We can't just be worried about where they're going to get their next meal. We also have to be worried about the long term. Where are they going to be in a year? Where are they going to be in 5 years? How are we going to help them not be poor and not stay poor? So those are the questions, and they're tough questions. If they were easy, this would be solved and we would be talking about something else. But they're clearly not solved. Okay, so we have to tackle these issues. And I think when it comes to policy, there's a lot of rhetoric. So what you have to do is, again, first you got to start with the scripture. What does that say in terms of the principles that guide our viewpoint? But then you have to put your economics hats on, because if you don't, then we're going to have a lot of, good-intentioned policies that get us where we don't want to be. And actually, many of these good-intentioned policies cause harm. So and again, as Christians, we don't have the luxury of doing that. It's poor stewardship. So where do we start? We are unique. We know that. Here's a picture. And this is perfect timing since we just came out of a snowstorm. You guys probably don't get much snow here. But anybody from an area with lots of snow? Yeah, some of you northerners. So here on the left, what do you think that is a picture of? It's snowflakes, right? It's a snowstorm. What do you think this is a picture of here? Right, it's actually snowflakes under a microscope. And so I remember growing up, again, like I said, DC likes to get really panicky about snowstorms, but we always got snow days, so it was really exciting. My mom is from Massachusetts, where you have to get like 3 feet of snow for school to be closed. But what I remember doing is the nights we thought we were going to get snow is we'd look out in the dark, and you'd have to look at a lamppost to see the flakes falling. And you'd keep looking out to see if it started snowing, and then you get really excited. So that's what that picture on the left looks like. It's when you look outside at the snow. The flakes all look the same. But actually, scientists have done research on this, and this one scientist actually examined hundreds and hundreds of snowflakes under a microscope, and no 2 snowflakes have ever been known to be the same. They're all different. That's how we are. Some of you are getting ready to watch the Super Bowl. If you watch the Super Bowl and you look out at the crowd of people in the stadium from afar, they don't look that different. We all have eyes, we have noses, we have hair, most of us, right? We all have physical characteristics that are rather similar. But if you polled all those people sitting in that stadium about their life experiences, where they grew up, how they view the world, it would be very different. And so while we are similar, at our core, we are special and we are distinct. So you can see where I'm going with this, hopefully. I'm setting us up to talk about something called income inequality. So let's kind of flesh this out a little bit more. I think the other really important, and I talked about this a little bit, distinction is what we call the cultural mandate. Is that God created us to not just take care of the garden, but to work it. So you were created to do something special that only you can do, even though there may be many, many other people in your profession. So if God is calling you to be a software engineer, yes, there are other software engineers in the world, but only you can do what He created you to do. And that work of being a software engineer, no matter how tedious it seems, can bring glory to Him and fulfillment to you. That's exciting. Because I think as Christians, a lot of times we get stuck into the trap of thinking that unless I'm working in the church or volunteering in the church or doing mission work, I'm not actually serving God. But you can serve God and open a restaurant. You can serve God and be a CEO. You can serve God and be an economist. You can serve God in the secular. So what I'm trying to say and what that video was trying to portray is this secular sacred divide that we've kind of created in our world shouldn't exist. Because God didn't create us just to spend time with Him on Sunday morning. Everything we do is about kingdom building. And so you can be a barista at a coffee shop, and that's part of kingdom building. And the world needs baristas, so it's exciting. Okay? Even though you may not be excited about being a barista, but I mean, my first job, I was guest teaching in some of the classes today. One of my first jobs was working in Baskin-Robbins, which I don't know if you guys know what that is, an ice cream shop. It was in a strip mall. I was 15. I had no idea what I was doing. And I remember that the guy didn't want us wasting ice cream, so he turned the freezer down, the guy who owned the store, really, really low. So you got a really good arm workout trying to get that ice cream out. I did not love that job, by the way. I thought there was going to be all this, ice cream to eat, but it was actually hard work. But I came to it when I was 15 and I had very little skills. I wasn't very highly productive. I didn't have a lot of knowledge about the business, but I had an opportunity. So that's really what we're going to ultimately talk about tonight, is how do we get a society rich with opportunities. This is one of I have two posters I'm going to show you tonight, or two pictures from the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I'm sure you've all heard of. This woman, who I don't know, I took this picture off of the internet. She is carrying a handmade poster that says, "One day the poor will have nothing left to eat but the rich." So I think this is really at the core of the conversation about income inequality. And the core of the conversation, and again, this requires us to put our economic thinking hats on, is how is wealth created? How does a society generate wealth in the first place? If you believe that the only way somebody gets rich is by taking it from somebody else, then you should be very concerned about income inequality. Because it means anybody that has high levels of income has stolen their way to the top. They've engaged in theft. That's bad, and we know that that's unbiblical, right? It's pretty clear. So the premise of this poster, and I don't know her, so I'm not picking on her personally, but the premise of the poster is that very thing. That wealth is what we call in economics a zero-sum game. That the only way one person can acquire something is by taking it from someone else. So think about, if I brought, we don't have we have a big audience here. If I brought in a pie, and I walked up to you and I said, you get the first piece. And let's just pretend I see a flavor that you happen to like. If I say she gets the first piece and the rest of you can fight over it, that's kind of stinky for the rest of you. I mean, she's in a good spot, especially if she's hungry and I picked a flavor that she likes, right? So you might just say, I'm going to take some, I'll take a big piece, maybe I'll have some for later, I have no idea. Right? But it's good for you, but it's kind of bad for everyone else. But this is called fixed pie thinking. If we assume that economies are built and wealth is created when some people who are the very rich are getting their wealth by taking it from others, then that's a bad situation. Now, in a well-functioning market economy based on voluntary trade, that's not what happens. In fact, people who earn high levels of income can only get their paychecks if we buy the stuff that they're throwing at us. So the only in a well-functioning market, the only reason that Steve Jobs was rich was because we liked what he brought to the table. And he had to put significant risk into bringing that to us. It's not like he just snapped his fingers and said, iPad. There was a lot of money invested in it, there were a lot of focus groups, and there were a lot that could go wrong. We could have all hated the iPad, and he would have lost billions on that. He makes a bet. He's taking a calculated risk. So there's no guarantees, even for the super wealthy. But ultimately, he is only going to earn high rates of return or profits if he serves people, if he makes their lives better in some way. And consumers are driving the value out of those products. And the societal wealth creation that comes from that is actually pretty massive. So Bill Gates, very high income levels, high levels of wealth as well. Income and wealth are different, by the way. They're not the same. But Bill Gates had to theoretically give us something that we liked that made our lives better. My computer's running off Windows. It's my work computer, so I didn't technically choose it, but my home computer runs off Windows as well. So for you Apple people, you might not think Bill Gates did a good job, but you have choices in the market economy, right? And that's valuable for consumers as well. So Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, among other, Michael Dell, they have to tough it out. They have to compete. And what we tend to see is higher quality and lower prices through that competitive process. And they become very rich. And so the question is that a bad thing? Is there something immoral about it? Well, let's talk a little bit. To unpack this, we got to understand, how do we measure income inequality? And this is the part of the talk where it would be easy to lose people, eyes glaze over, because I start throwing statistics at you, and I'm going to make it very user-friendly. So this is the Gini coefficient, and this is the way that economists measure income inequality. It's just a statistical measurement tool. They measure income holdings over groups of people. So we could measure income inequality in this room. We could measure income inequality over Charleston, South Carolina. We could measure income inequality over the state of South Carolina. And then we could measure it over the United States. It's based on the group that you choose to collect data over. It ranges between 0 and 1. A Gini coefficient of 1 does not exist in the real world. It means that one person has all the income and everybody else has 0. That's bad, right? It's not a good situation. Because those of us who don't have all the income are kind of struggling to figure out how to survive. A Gini coefficient of 0 means perfect equality. Everybody has the same amount of income. This is also a hypothetical. We don't live in that world either. So we're really living in the middle. The discussion that you hear on the news today is that income inequality is increasing, as measured by this Gini coefficient. And if you look at the graph, that's true. We're seeing a slight uptick here in the Gini. So remember, as it gets getting closer to 1, we're getting less equal in terms of our income holdings. Now, how is this measured? It's measured by household tax returns. So again, and by the way, when we're doing any of these kind of measurement tools, they're not perfect. So it's probably one of the better tools we have, but it's certainly not perfect. Because, for example, if you never paid taxes, if you never filed your income, then you're not in the numbers, you're not represented at all. Okay, so when we look at what's going on in the United States, this is shares of income after transfer payments and taxes are paid. Okay, why does that matter? Well, if I make, if I'm kind of the super rich, if I make $1 million a year, I'm paying a significant portion of that income in taxes. Then that money is money that's going out of my paycheck. So we need to be measuring my actual income, which is income after taxes. Same thing on the bottom scale. If you have a very low income and you're receiving transfer payments, then you're getting an influx to your income. Does that make sense? So if you're a recipient of some federal program, whether it's food stamps or something like that, it's an inflow into your income. So it has to be accounted if we're going to get an accurate picture of our wealth or our income holdings. So when you look here, this I think is what gets the most visceral response in the media. If you look at the highest quintile, this is comparing 1979 to 2007. The top 1% hold a lot of the income, right? So that's one thing that's obvious from this chart. But the other thing that's kind of telling is that look at 1979 compared to 2007. If you look at the lowest quintile, what this data suggests is that in 1979, the poor, the people in the lowest income quintile, held more income than they did in 2007. So this would get to the argument that the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer. So one could look at this data and say we have some problems on our hands. It seems that the rich are extremely wealthy in terms of their overall income holdings relative to the rest of the population. And it kind of looks like over the progression of time, the poor are not faring very well. Because in 1979, they're holding a greater percent of the total income than they are in 2007. And we're going to talk a little bit through this. Because if you just look at this, you might come to some different conclusions than if you actually understand how we collect this data and what it looks like. So here's kind of, I'm trying to take a complex topic and distill it in an interesting way, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But here are some of the nuts and bolts behind measuring income inequality. And why this is important is because if we don't do this, we're going to get a wrong reflection of what's really going on in the world. Number one is transfer payments. So when we started talking about income inequality in the recent past, a couple of economists did a study and they said, hey, the rich are getting richer at the expense of the poor, but they didn't include transfer payments in their data. So it exacerbated income inequality. If you don't count kind of a cash transfer to my income, then it's going, especially if I'm in the poorest quintile, it's going to make me look poorer than I actually am. So unless we're counting transfer payments, we're not getting an accurate reflection. We have a large social safety net in this country, so we have to count that. Tax code changes. This is another thing. What we hear a lot in the media is that in the 1980s, we see this huge uptick in the Gini. So from 1980 onward, the rich started getting a lot richer at the expense of the poor. So what was happening in 1980? Well, in 1981 and 1986, there were massive tax code changes. And the tax code changes were over capital gains taxes. And so what you saw is that it became attractive overnight for CEOs, instead of holding their stocks that were taxed as business income, they were now holding those stocks taxed as personal income. So what happened is that overnight we had an accounting change. So it made, like from day one in 1980 to day two in 1980, it looked like overnight the rich got extraordinarily richer. When actually what happened is we had an accounting change. That is significant because we can't claim that in 1980 the rich did something nefarious if they didn't actually do it. And what we saw was that the tax code changed such that their personal incomes went kind of blossomed overnight. And we could talk about the implications of taxing the rich later. That's not for this conversation. But what I'm telling you happened here is that income inequality looked worse the way we measure it, but really the rich, their income didn't change, nor did the poor change in 1980 and 1986, but we changed the tax structure. So that's kind of the most challenging one. I think the most important one is this issue of changing households. So remember the graph that I just showed you. If we look at everybody's income tax statement in 1979, for all income quintiles, quintile just means what we divided the population by 5, and then we do the same thing and measure everybody's income in 2007, here's the problem. Unless we're following an individual, we don't know if we're capturing the same individuals in 1979 as we do in 2007. Well, let me give you an example. When I was 15 and I worked at that Baskin-Robbins store, my income was, $1,000 a year. I don't know. Something like that. Something really, really low. Okay? But if you measured my income 2 decades later, I wasn't in the lowest income quintile anymore. I was in a higher income quintile. That's what we want. We want a society where people who may start out in the lowest income quintile, but they don't stay there. And so the problem with the way we measure income inequality is the people that were poor in 1979, we don't know if we're measuring the same people. So actually income mobility is a much better reflection of overall prosperity. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So I know some of this is complicated, but I think, again, if we're just looking for, kind of sound bites on the media to dissect very complicated information, as Christians, we got to know that we're probably not going to get where we need to be. So we're going to actually have to do kind of some discerning in this process. So here's a study that actually followed individuals. So you were in this quintile in 1979, and we followed you for 10 years and looked at your income, okay? And here's the stats. So if you were in the lowest income quintile, you had like a 57% chance of moving to a higher quintile in 10 years. If you were in the second lowest quintile, so as we proceed down here, we're getting richer and richer and richer. Okay, so fourth lowest, this is the second richest quintile. So the good news about this data is that the lower income quintile you start in, the more mobility you seem to have. So according to this data, you're more likely, if you're in the lowest income quintile, meaning the poorest in this country, you're likely not to be there in 9 years. 58% chance. Well, we shouldn't, and you know, in the rhetoric and in the media, we always talk about income mobility for the poor, which is important, but we never talk about income mobility for the rich. And I think we have to talk about that if we're going to be honest about this. So look at the top 1%. This is the top 1% of all income earners in this country. You have an equal chance, almost 58% chance, of not being in that income quintile in 9 years. So it's a rat race. It's tough to stay at the top. And that, you know, is probably kind of intuitive, right? Think about being someone that's the head of a Fortune 500 company and the pressure that's on you to innovate and continue to be the best. The only way, again, in a well-functioning economy that you're going to be the best is if you serve consumers with better quality at lower prices, giving us things that make our lives better, that are more and more affordable. So the pressure is on these guys. And the data shows that they're unlikely to stay there. Some of them do, but not all of them do. That's equally important because in a market economy, people should only be super rich if they have served us, if they have made our lives extraordinarily better. If you are willing to fork over $500 for your smartphone and you did it voluntarily, all I can assume is that you would rather have your smartphone than that $500 part of your paycheck. You are voting with your feet. You are telling Steve Jobs or whoever you bought the smartphone from, good job, I like it, keep it coming. Right? And that's important because the minute you walk away from them and go to someone else, they're under pressure. Because they have in their own self-interest, they want to stay in the top 1% if possible. But the pressure's on. And this pressure situation I'm going to come back to in a little bit because I actually think that this is where we're running into some trouble in this country. So here's some data, excuse me, about income mobility in this country. And this is, again, where I think historically the United States has been a place where you can come, you cannot have a lot of education, you cannot have a college degree, and you can create wealth. You could become rich, okay? So, you know, over the past couple centuries, that's exactly what we've seen, is people coming to this country with almost nothing, you know, no money in their pockets, and making a life for themselves. And maybe they don't all become billionaires, but they can create value. They can create wealth. And they've left other countries to do so. And historically, it's been a place where each generation does better in terms of income and overall wealth than their parents. And so what we see is that roughly half of taxpayers who began in the bottom income quintile in 1996 moved up to a higher one by 2005. That's only 9 years. That's encouraging. It isn't everything, but it's something. So again, income mobility, I think, is where we need to switch the conversation in our thinking, particularly as Christians. My assertion to you today is it is not important what the difference is between the richest person in this country and the poorest. That is not as significant as the relative level of thriving and prosperity of those at the bottom and our ability to get out of the bottom. We talked in some of the classes that I went in today that I asked people, would you rather be poor in this country right now, or would you rather be poor in Rwanda right now? Would you rather be poor in Ethiopia right now? Would you rather be poor in North Korea right now? It is a no-brainer. You'd rather be poor here. Why is that? because the relative level of thriving and prosperity, of overall flourishing in this country has historically been better than anybody could ever have imagined. And so the question for us is, as Christians, what is life like at the lowest income quintile, and how do we make it better? But not only that, how do we help more people move out of that income quintile? I want that number, instead of being 58%, to be 100%. How do we ensure that 100% of people that are in the start in the lowest income quintile get out? There's probably never a way to ensure that 100%, but how can we maximize that number? That's what income mobility concerns, and it's really, as Christians, kind of gets to this idea of flourishing. How do we care for the poorest among us, and how do we elevate them with dignity out of poverty? And it's a tough question. Again, if we had solved this issue, we would be talking about something else tonight. But we haven't. And again, so I think this is an important point. What we've noted is that mobility among all groups has been relatively unchanged. There's new data that just came out today about income mobility in this country, saying that it's kind of leveled off over the past few decades. This is where I think we should be worried as Christians. Again, I'm not worried that Bill Gates is richer than me, particularly. What I am worried about is my quality of life and the quality of life for people that are poor. I suspect you're worried about the same things. I don't know that anybody in this room is going to bed losing sleep about Bill Gates. Maybe you are, but I doubt it. But we want to care for ourselves and care for our family and make a better life for ourselves. But we also have this call to care for the poor. And so for Christians, our disagreement is really never over what we should do. I mean, I think we all agree we should care for the poor. I think it's typically over the means, the most appropriate way to do that. Okay. So I want to kind of talk about this other measure that I think is really helpful to think about what's it like to be in the lower income quintiles in this country. And this is this idea called consumption equality. So I tried to kind of pick pictures of things that are kind of outdated. So what's this top picture on the left? Anybody know? It's an old, yeah, you're laughing like I would never own that. It's an old TV. What's this? Air conditioner. Stove. Nobody would own the flip phone, right? What's that? I think we actually have the world's first microwave in my office, by the way. What's that? Refrigerator. Okay, so here again, when I think about myself compared to Bill Gates, I think he has a nice life. I've heard that he has a house that like does lots of things when people walk in the room. You know, it like shuts the blinds automatically and turns on music and flips artwork around, and that's all groovy and wonderful for him. But the consumption differences between me, an economist who works as an academic and in a nonprofit organization, so I'm not, you know, I don't consider myself to be rich. The real consumption differences between me and Bill Gates, almost zero. I took a plane to get to Charleston, South Carolina to talk to you guys. He takes planes too. He has his own private jet, so his life is slightly more convenient than mine in the sense that he can hop on that thing and it's probably in his backyard, whereas I have to go through customs or TSA or whatever and actually get on a plane. And I can't choose the exact time I want to leave. But we both have air travel, okay? We both have refrigeration, which is really important, particularly for the poor. It's really important to be able to refrigerate your food. Food preservation is something that has really kind of, it's a new phenomenon in human history. Before 1800, most people didn't have access to this in any real way. So as it turns out, there was a study done by the Department of Energy, and they were trying to figure out how much energy people consumed based on the stuff that they own. So when you plug something into a wall, you start using energy. And this study, this is actually, the full study is in my paper, but it's hard to read, so I just did a snapshot. But this is percentage of poor U.S. households which have various amenities. A poor U.S. household, so just to give you a sense of the numbers here, for a family of four, we're talking about $22,000 and change. If you are at or below that number, you're in the lowest income quintile, considered poor. Of those people, at the time this study was done, which is '05, so it's a little bit dated now, 99.6% of poor households in this country have a refrigerator. I don't know about you, but that's really important for people, all people. But it's particularly something we don't want the poor struggling with. Because think about what life is like if you don't have a refrigerator or a freezer. You have to buy fresh food every single day. That's way more expensive than being able to buy food and store it for later. So again, this is something that we take for granted all the time, but that's really important for quality of life. Just to give you an example, in the 1800s, do you know how people got ice? They actually bought it from trains that went up and down the East Coast or off of clipper ships that sailed up and down the Atlantic. In the late 1800s, there were 2 ice shortages. We just didn't have enough ice for everybody. And think about what life was like. You actually had to go get the ice off a ship or from a train, and then you had to somehow haul it back to your house, and it couldn't melt in the meantime. Then you usually stuck it under the ground and stuck your food in there. It was very tedious. It took a lot of your time just to get some food preservation. And a lot of times it didn't work. I imagine that there were a lot of kind of wrinkles in those plans. So the fact that the poor have refrigerators is extremely important and something we get to take for granted. Right now I have a 4-year-old boy and we have a huge dog, and my 4-year-old likes to take the ice out of the ice maker and skitter it across the kitchen floor. I don't really like that game because there's random pools of water that I slip on occasionally. But he gets to waste ice. He doesn't ever have to think about how he's going to get an ice cube. And he uses it just to keep his water cool, or his juice cool, excuse me. He's not depending on it to sustain his life. It's a total luxury good. 200 years ago, for most people, ice was such a luxury good that a lot of people didn't have it. So I will not go into this much detail over all these points, but my point here is that it's really important for the poor to have access to some of these things. And we know in this country that they do. 97.7% have a television. 78% have air conditioning. Air conditioning matters a lot for your quality of life, especially if you live in the South, right? 29.3% had internet service in their home. And what we're seeing is that over time that is rapidly increasing. So the pace of technological innovation is making these things more available to people in the lower income quintiles. I just read a study yesterday that said that in 1998, like 48% of US households had a computer. And now it's up to 70%. It's massive technological change that makes these things cheaper. And cheap means more access. This is what people who are poor don't have. They don't have access to goods and services they need to sustain their life, to enhance its quality. So these things are really important for us. So consumption equality matters a lot. I used to do, as part of this presentation, but I don't always have time to do the whole thing, is what I sometimes do in my classroom is I show a picture of a really expensive Lexus, like a 600 or I don't know, I'm not a car person, but a nice Lexus next to a Nissan Versa. And I've actually done the thought experiment of going onto the Lexus website and looking at all the amenities that are on that Lexus 600. And then looking at all the amenities on the Nissan Versa. And do you know what? In real terms, these cars are very similar. Now, if you're a car person, I know that we might argue over that. But the Nissan Versa has computers, it has airbags, it passes safety ratings, and it's $10,000. Whereas the Lexus that, to me, even on the picture they look very similar, is $70,000. So again, when we're talking about consumption equality and the difference between the car that Bill Gates gets to choose and the car that I get to choose, in real terms, we both get cars that get us where we need to go and are relatively safe. By the way, airbags are a relatively new thing. I think they came out in about 1986, and the first airbags, passenger side airbags, were on a Porsche. So you had to be extremely wealthy to have the luxury of having a passenger side airbag in your car. The rest of the world did not have access to that. Now, in the $10,000 Nissan Versa, there's like 12 airbags. So that's a good thing for all of us. So again, it's about what I'm trying to get at here is it's not just again, the difference between the super rich and the poorest of the poor. It's what is the level of thriving and prosperity of the poor, and how do we get them out of the lowest quintiles? And that matters if we're talking about the poor in this country and the poor in Bangladesh. But those relative degrees of poverty are very different. This, I think, as Christians thinking about flourishing, this is one of my favorite graphs. This is a graph of world GDP from time 0 to 2001. Now these are back of the envelope calculations, because obviously in 1000 BC or AD we were not collecting data. But what it shows is that most of human existence has been almost at $0. So most of human history has been a fight for survival. People were fighting off animal predators, people were fighting off other people predators, we were struggling to get food, struggling to get shelter, struggling to get clean water. And then something happened. We see this hockey stick effect in a lot of the world, where we got extraordinarily rich. And I think as people who live in this country, when we talk about income inequality, we kind of say, oh, those top 1%, they have it all. And we may want what they have. But you've probably never really given a lot of thought to the fact that you are sitting in this room, you are of the richest people who have ever walked the planet. You are richer, some of you heard me say this earlier today, so sorry for the repeat, but you're richer than Napoleon could have dreamt of being, and he was a king. He did not have a smartphone that told him how, to get to the next location. He did not have Yelp to tell him where to go to dinner. He didn't even have restaurants, probably, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that you have. Plumbing, for example, electricity, that kings and queens could not even conceive of. So wealth and poverty are relative. But this is exciting. It's exciting because we're ignorant beneficiaries of it, meaning we don't know how to use all the products and goods and services we rely on every day. I mean, have you ever thought about what goes into making a toothbrush or toothpaste? No, you just buy them and you use them. And I bet most of you don't even price shop when you buy a toothbrush, because it's such an insignificant portion of your overall income. You might just buy what's on sale. I mean, does anybody go on Amazon and do reviews of toothbrushes before you buy them? Probably not for most of us. We just pick one out. Right? We don't have to know how to do all the things we need to not just survive, but to thrive. And in a rich country like the United States, that affects all income quintiles. So even the people that are in the lowest income quintile, they have the benefits of toothbrush and toothpaste and dental hygiene, these things that, by the way, until recently in human history, many, many people died from tooth decay. Because if you get a tooth infection, it goes to your brain, you die. So just until recently, we have not been dying from root canals. That's pretty profound. And that impacts the poor as well. So the question here is, what can we do for the poor? The problem with being poor, and again, I'm kind of talking about poverty in two different ways. There's U.S. poverty, domestic poverty, and then there's global poverty. And they have to be dealt with differently. But what I would say is that there are places right now where women spend most of their productive hours every day getting water. Okay, it's like the ice example that I gave you. You get up in the morning with children in tow, you have buckets, and you go to a river that's dirty. And you get dirty water. And you wash your clothes in it, and you bathe in it, you bathe your children, you take the water, you take it back home. Could be 4 miles each day and 100 degrees. So most of the productive hours of your day are spent surviving, in an effort to survive. So the question for the poor is, what do we want for them? Well, we want them the opportunity to thrive, not just survive. So that graph I showed you, where we kind of hit the Industrial Revolution and we get the hockey stick effect, that's when we started to really be able to thrive. Okay, so the question is, what do we want for the poor? I would argue that both in the United States and across the globe, we want more Bill Gates. We want more Steve Jobs. We want people who are creative, made in the image of God, Because that applies to people who are poor in the Congo just as much as it applies to us. We want them the opportunity to put their creative talents to use to make the world a better place. That's really important. So the question is, what kind of society do we need for that to happen? I'm going to end with this idea of cronyism, because I think it's the biggest threat, at least domestically, for income mobility and this idea of income inequality. This is another poster from the Occupy movement. This woman says, "I don't mind you being rich, I mind you buying my government." And I really couldn't agree with her more. This is an idea that is kind of getting a lot of play in the media right now, and it's this issue of cronyism. Cronyism is when big government, or excuse me, big corporations set up shop on K Street. So if any of you ever go to DC, if you drive down K Street, it's where all the lobbyists set up shop. They spend millions of dollars luring politicians to give them favor or subsidies or benefits or protections so that other people can't compete. It's very, very dangerous because theoretically the poor could do that too, but why can't they actually do that? I mean, we don't restrict them from doing it nominally, but why can't they actually do that? They can't play that game because they don't have millions of dollars to hire fancy lawyers to lobby politicians for them. So essentially, what we're saying, some people call this crony capitalism. What we're seeing is an environment where the government has created this kind of entitlement culture among firms. And that instead of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs duking it out for our business, giving us better products at lower prices, we're actually seeing these guys, and not those two in particular, I'm not kind of picking on them, but we're seeing big firms go to K Street and say, hey, protect my industry, or give me a subsidy. And so we're keeping out the little guys. Because the little guys, the startup companies, who don't have a lot of capital, can't compete with that. That, cronyism, is an environment where the rich get richer at the expense of the poor. And it's my biggest concern as we, kind of are off into the 21st century. Because we used to be a country where you could be the little guy and become the big guy. But all through that whole path, you still had to serve your customers. You had to have integrity. You had to do your job well. Cronyism is about rigging the game for your benefit. I believe it's the biggest threat to income mobility. I believe it's going to exacerbate income inequality. And I think it's going to harm the poor disproportionately. Right now, what we're seeing is how this plays out is in occupational licensing. What that means is that people in certain occupations are going to the government, and this happens on a statewide level, and they're saying, hey, here's a real life example. In New York City, you can go to vendors on the street, and there are women and men who will braid your hair. This doesn't require a PhD. It's hair braiding. But there are people who are already doing that, and so they want to limit competition. And so they're going to the state of New York and saying, we think you need to have a license to be a hair braider. We want to protect the 10 of us that already exist. We don't want people coming in on our turf. Well, what does this do to somebody who doesn't have a lot of capital, doesn't have a lot of wealth? If you can't afford to go to school to get a license to braid hair, you got to pick something else to do. So we've just limited opportunities for people who are not already members of the club. But the other problem is that we're harming innovation in those fields. So we see across the country increasing licensing requirements in things like being a florist. They now want you to go to school for that. My favorite is being a fortune teller, which I don't put a lot of stock in the first place. I've never been to one, but I can't imagine what kind of license you need to be a good fortune teller. But in some states, that's the case. This is not about consumer advocacy or consumer protection. This is about people forming a club, lobbying the state to protect them at the expense of the little guy. So my analogy is like sending David off to fight Goliath. Well, we've taken his slingshot. He doesn't have a chance. That is inherently unfair, and it's inherently unjust. And that's, I think, as Christians, we have to be educated about this. We have to fight against it. Because it's the only way the little guy, no matter who they are, and we all in this room could be the little guy. You got to start somewhere, right? That's the only way that that little guy has a fighting chance. And so, again, I think my takeaway tonight is, let's refocus from income inequality to income mobility. And let's really address this issue of cronyism head on. Become aware about it and fight against it. And that's all I have. I'll take questions if people have them.